Okay, we have Geoff, Janet. Awesome. And we're just waiting on Krista. Okay, great. There we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and for joining another Conservation Happy Hour. This is part of our fall series. And for participating in this important conversation about protecting both polar bears and people in a melting Arctic. So today I am joined, they may be off screen for part of it, but you can definitely see a batch of them now. So of course, Krista Wright, the Executive Director of Polar Bears International, Janet Stringer, our Manager of Donor Relations. KT Miller is also here with us. She is behind the scenes and doing some recording for us. And then of course, Geoff York, who will be the main presenter today. So before we get to the actual presentation, just a little bit of our Zoom housekeeping. I'm seeing a lot of the names on this list. I recognize them and know that you are pros at this and have been to many of these before. But for those who have not attended one of these events, I just want to make sure that you all know how to use the tools to engage in this presentation. So the purpose of these events is to share work that is happening in the polar bear conservation world with you and to connect you to the work that you so generously support. And in that spirit, we of course want you to be able to ask questions. And so there are a couple of tools within Zoom that will allow you to engage with us and engage with this presentation. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen toolbar, you should see you'll see a chat icon, looks like a little speech bubble, and that's for some of the more informal chat. I see a ton of chat there already, so just say hi, let us know where you're watching from. If you have any questions, you can, or any questions or struggling with the tech, you can put them in there and we'll help you. Now, if you have a formal question for Geoff or for Krista or Janet, we ask you to please type that and submit it through the Q&A feature. So that's also an icon that you should be seeing on the bottom of your Zoom window. And we encourage you to type questions as they come up. As you have them, we'll try to weave them into this conversation and answer them in real time as best we can. And anything we don't get to during the presentation, we will definitely loop back to at the end. So with that, close Zoom housekeeping and we'll get to the topic at hand today. So as probably most people tuning into this webinar know, or this presentation know, the greatest threat to polar bears is sea ice loss due to human-caused climate change. And beyond just the ecosystem and that habitat loss, not just because that's clearly obviously significant, but that has some very immediate and quite literally on the ground impacts for polar bears as they're spending more time off of this ecosystem and on land. And so today we'll be hearing from our Senior Director of Conservation and a staff scientist, Geoff York, who leads a lot of our efforts in addressing these challenges in a rapidly changing Arctic. So Geoff, thank you very much for being here with us today. And I believe you are tuning in from our interpretive space in Churchill, Manitoba, correct?
I am. It's a balmy -18 Celsius for those of you outside the US. And for those of you inside the US, that's about 0 degrees with north winds bringing the wind chill down to -21 Fahrenheit. So it is winter outside.
Yes, it certainly is. It looks wintry behind you and completely dark. So, so Geoff, before we get started, can you give us a little background on your history with this work in polar bear conservation up until this point?
Sure. So I've been working in the Arctic now for almost 30 years, and on polar bears specifically for 20 even this year, with 16 of those doing capture work out on the sea ice with polar bears and their natural habitat. And since that time, or across that time, also focusing on polar bears and people living together and the problems that arise when we meet polar bears out on the land, around communities, at places of work, or when people are recreating. So conflict has been a threat, or conflict avoidance, during that 20-year career with polar bears.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have been in the field for this last month, correct?
I have. I'm the lucky one person that is
You
traveling
are.
right now. I was the last one traveling heading into March, and I'm the only one traveling now. And it's a huge honor actually to be up here. It's such a different season, as you could imagine, in a town that relies heavily on tourism, to have very few visitors come up. And we've also had some fantastic bear viewing activity, and it was just neat to be a part of our small team trying to continue to deliver our conservation work and some of our research work on the ground.
Yeah, well, it's certainly, I'm not sure. I hope that some of the people watching this have been able to tune into some of that outreach and see that even from down here, it has looked like a truly incredible season. And
Absolutely.
Geoff,
And anyone who was
oh, go ahead.
watching today, they probably noticed one thing is there have been fewer and fewer bears the last couple of days, which is a great thing. The ice is coming in now pretty strongly, especially with these temperatures and with these favorable winds. And we're seeing very few bears now in the wildlife management area and around town. So that's great news for the bears, and perfect timing for our activities here in Churchill wrapping up this week.
Yeah, it's always bittersweet. Sad to see them go, but also very excited to see them out on their natural habitat. Which brings us to my next question, which is really, can you give our viewers a little bit of a high-level view of the situation in the Arctic right now with sea ice loss, and what are the ripple effects of sea ice loss on polar bears and people as their communities are starting to continually overlap more and more?
Sure. So this year in September, which is when we measure what we call the sea ice minimum sea ice extent, 2020 came in as the second lowest on record, which is not good news. It's great that it wasn't a record year in September. However, as the fall proceeded, we did break records. And in October, throughout the entire month of October, we were well outside the historic norm for sea ice that late in the year, largely due to fairly massive sea ice loss and a very slow initial refreeze across the Russian Arctic and into the Chukchi Sea by Alaska. So we're still trending in the wrong direction globally. If you kind of look more specifically in Canada and in Hudson Bay, we've actually gotten lucky the last few years. So weather in the summer in the central Canadian Arctic and subarctic has been relatively cool. So polar bears in this region have gotten a break. This year, if things go the way they certainly look like they're going today, will be the third good year in a row for this subpopulation. And that's exactly what bears need to make it from a cub of the year into that early adulthood phase. So around the Arctic, as we're seeing these record lows, as we're seeing sea ice pull back from shores and decrease both in extent and volume, we're seeing changes in the distribution and abundance of bears. Here in Western Hudson Bay, this population's dropped by nearly 30% in the last 40 years. And it seems like we might be in the second part of another decline, kind of yet to be determined as we get new data coming in. We're also seeing around the Arctic more bears spending longer time ashore in more places. And that's very germane to the discussion we're having tonight on human polar bear conflict.
Yes, and we actually pulled up a video to share with everyone. This is from the Siberian Times. And as I pull this up, Geoff, I'm hoping that you might just be able to give us a little bit of an overview of what specifically is happening in this video, and also what that means for polar bears across the Arctic and where we are starting to see this.
Sure. So this is a video some of you may have seen from Nova Zemlya. It's just outside of a landfill next to an Arctic community there. what you're watching is a dump truck full of garbage that's broken down, and how quickly bears surround the dump truck and climb up into it. So seeing the strength and agility of these bears in this setting, it's sad that they're showing us the strength and agility to get to human trash, but it's impressive how easily they pull themselves up into the back of that. And so when we talk about human bear conflict, human bear interaction, this is exactly the sort of scenario we're trying to avoid. This is the sort of scenario we're trying to work to, provide tools to help keep people, and in this case, these polar bears, safe from harm.
Yes, it is. We don't have to watch the whole clip here, but it is certainly striking and memorable. And just seeing polar bears interact in a way that I have, I have certainly never seen. It's quite impressive. They look a bit like gymnasts, to be honest, in this video. So, and as is true in conservation, bears spending more time on land, there is no one size solution that will fit all here. And so when communities of polar bears and people are overlapping more and more, keeping both safe requires a pretty diversified approach, as I understand it. And Geoff, I would love to talk through some of those angles and those different approaches, because you're involved through quite a few angles, really. And maybe we can start with the working groups that you're a part of, both on an international level and a more local level in Churchill. So you are a member of the Polar Bear Range States Conflict Working Group. Can you tell us a little bit about what that group is and what the larger goals of that group are?
Sure. So the polar bear range states are the 5 polar bear nations: Russia, US, Canada, Greenland, and Norway. And they come together on a regular basis to discuss issues of shared concern and hopefully issues of shared action that they can take at that international level to conserve polar bears. One of the things they grabbed onto early on was conflict and trying to get ahead of the curve to reduce or mitigate bear-human interactions that might lead to conflict. So they created that as their first working group. And I've been on it since its inception, and I've been fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at these things, to be the chair for a couple of years. This group is trying to pool international data to really get our hands quantitatively on what's happening around the Arctic. We all hear from frontline managers in all 5 of those range states concern about increasing polar bear human interaction, concern about what may yet come as the sea ice continues to recede. So it's really a direct response to that concern, from the frontline folks around the Arctic there. We're also trying to share information, to share resources, and to do some research to look at ways we can do things better.
It's a pretty massive source of collaboration, really, and pretty amazing, and I imagine complicated to orchestrate as well. So wondering too if you can then tell us a little bit about a bit of a smaller version of a working group, the Churchill Polar Bear Safe Working Group that you are also a part of, and what is this group? What is the overall objective, and what sort of initiatives are they implementing in the community?
Sure. So it's a great case of, from global to local, working at that international scale where there are complications, and depending on governments in any given year, some folks take the lead and are very active, and some countries kind of fade out depending on, their national politics and their capacity as well, for sure. Taking that down, scaling that down to the local level, the town of Churchill here, where I'm at today, reached out to us several years ago, and we've been having discussions ongoing on how the community of Churchill could be more involved directly in management of bears in the area, and specifically on issues of polar bear safety, polar bear conflict. And so Polar Bears International helped stand up this community-based group through the hire of a professional facilitator that was able to sit with the town mayor, town council, and really help them, build this from the ground up and get it rolling. We're just finishing our first full year of that group being active. And we really look to the town to say, what are your concerns? What are your priorities? And how can we help you fulfill those? So it started off with a local concern here about where problem bears that are captured by the polar bear alert program that the province runs were taken when they're returned to the wild, when they're dropped back off. Historically, they're flown a fair bit north of Churchill, which sets up a potential issue that those problem bears continue north and end up in the community of Arviat, which is part of Nunavut. And of course, they're not too happy if problem bears from a different province and a different town come up their way. So the community here asked that the province consider relocating those bears southeast of Churchill instead of north, just to give them, a chance of not getting into trouble in another town and keep them down in Manitoba. So that's one early thing we've worked on there. We're also working with the town on getting bear-resistant trash bins around town. If you've been up to Churchill, you may or may not have noticed on waste collection day, trash bags are sitting out on the ground in the morning, totally accessible to bears and other wildlife. And that's just not a good situation. So while the town has done a great job of tidying up their old landfill, closing that down, securing trash once it's collected, there's still a weak link at the household end of things that we're working with them to wrap it up and to make that much less of a potential reward area. And then the third quick thing we're working on with them is just sitting down and going over bear safety messaging. We know now from social science work that people aren't really good under stress at remembering, a 3 or 4 page pamphlet on bear safety. They are really good at remembering 3 things. So what 3 things should we be telling people in polar bear country? And what 3 things make sense for Churchill in this region there? So we're working on condensed safety messages, different ways of presenting that, especially to visitors, whether it be at a train station, airport, public restroom, or on a door as you're walking out of a hotel or restaurant, just to remind you that you are indeed in polar bear country and to keep your head up.
And we have a couple of questions that have come in, Geoff, related to this. So this first one is from David. David asks, are the people in Churchill generally receptive to your thoughts and recommendations?
I would say people in Churchill are receptive to outside input, not mine specifically in that sense. And what we've done with the working group is it's not our working group, it's the town's working group. So we, Polar Bears International, are just one voice of many. We've also brought in provincial voices and federal research biology partners to provide relevant information specific to the subpopulation, so the community members who are part of the team can get the best information to make the choices they want to make. Science only takes us so far. I can present tools, I can present options, I can discuss pros and cons of things, but at the end of the day, the community needs to decide what works best here for them.
Yeah. And I have another question here from Georgie. Georgie asks, well, when Georgie was in Churchill, witnessed a bear being flown via helicopter, which was quite the sight. Indeed it is. Has there been an increase or decrease in more bears coming into town that you've noticed across your career?
There was a slight increase going into the early 2000s, and then that's become variable since then, depending very much on when the bears come offshore and where they come offshore, along with how long they stay on shore. So this year is a great example. The sea ice lingered longer this summer, and when the polar bears came ashore, they came ashore a little bit further south and east than they have in many years. And so when they did fall surveys here, about 2/3 of the polar bears that could be visibly seen on the coast were a fair bit east of Churchill and quite a bit further south. And the polar bear alert team in here had no significant call outs until I would say mid-October, mid to late October. When I arrived in Churchill on October 20th, there were no bears in D20 at all. They hadn't handled a single one this season, which is great. But it also is reflective of just not many bears being around town this season, due to where they got off the ice. That changed going into November, and they did finally pick up, I think, a total of 5 last time I had an update from conservation, but that's still a pretty low number compared to some years past where they'll handle close to 200 bears in a single season.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more question before we keep going. Randy asked, do you know how many days the bears were off the ice this year in that region?
This year, we're right about 132, 133 days from when they came off, which is pretty good. That's a number that we'd like to see going into the future, but we're unlikely to see going into the future. And that gets back to comments I made at the start, is we're at the end of what is shaping up to be the 3rd consecutive good year for polar bears in the Western Hudson Bay population, which is much needed.
Yes, indeed it is. And actually one more, this is a really good one. Richard Beck wants to know, have you seen any kois this year?
We have seen quite a few family groups, and it's something we've noticed over the past few years. There have been some changes in both the abundance or apparent abundance and also distribution of bears in the viewing area where we work with Buggy One. We weren't seeing quite the density of bears we used to see, and we haven't seen as many older males that used to dominate. If you've been up here in the past, it was pretty common to see males kind of along the shore, hanging out in kelp beds, napping, sparring if you're lucky. And this year it's been a lot of younger bears and a lot more family groups. So I would say the icing on that cake was seeing a mom with triplets for the first time in the fall since 1996 here, which is another excellent indication of a good year.
Yes, I know that was certainly my highlight from watching the cams this year, was watching that mom with triplets. Okay, let's pivot a little bit. So this is a good overview of sort of the community initiatives and collaborative efforts around keeping polar bears and people safe. And I'd like to look at another angle that you're also involved in, Geoff, which is you participated in some research around this larger topic. And can you give us a little sense for the role that research is playing in investigating this question of how to reduce conflict between human and bears?
Sure. So we have, and this takes us back up to that range states level, we have a number of questions on things we don't yet know with polar bears, or don't know quantitatively, regarding how well they smell, what smells are of intense interest, what smells might be intensely uninteresting, or possibly a scent that could be used, to keep a bear from going into an area. So there's a lot on polar bear olfaction that we could learn and would be very relevant to conflict and deterrence. There are things we didn't know about bear spray. Bear spray, for those of you who have lived in or traveled in North American West, is very commonly carried and used with brown bears. In the North, there's been some resistance to its use. There's been a sense that it wouldn't work on polar bears, that it wouldn't work in the cold, that it wouldn't work in the predominantly windy conditions. And so we said, hey, we can test that stuff. We can look at the data and we can do some lab work. So the first paper we just came out with, and this was working with our partner Tom Smith at Brigham Young University and others, looked at those lab-based questions. And what we found through doing that was even temperatures down to -23, bear spray would come out up to a 2-meter range, which was good. Even at wind speeds up to 10 meters per second, which is quite high, the spray would come out to almost 4 meters. And we also looked at questions around, should I test fire a can, should I not? And what about can expiry dates? And we definitely found that any firing of the can quickly reduced its head pressure, so its capacity to deliver spray, and that age seemed to match very well with current expiry dates that manufacturing is putting on there. So at the end of that very lab-based study, all of our data fully supported carrying bear spray everywhere bears occur, including where polar bears occur.
Yeah, that is a great confirmation because it is shockingly effective. I've only seen it test fired once, and I was standing quite a ways away, and I definitely knew that it was around. So it's great to have some of those unanswered questions confirmed, so that we know that it is an effective deterrent. We have a couple
Absolutely.
of
Go ahead.
questions here. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there are just so many great questions. I'm just jumping at the bit to get them to you, Geoff. So Jane Gerber wants to know, how has the temperature impacted the dens in the peat?
Good question. So in some areas, and we've seen this more from our partner, Marty Obard, and his now replacement biologist, as Marty has retired, Joe Northrup, down in Ontario and southern Hudson Bay, is the features that polar bears use in this region to dig into the den. So they're called pulses, where frozen ice kind of raises tundra up and creates something that polar bears can then tunnel into to create their den. When temperatures warm, if there are excessive wildfires in an area, those geomorphic land features melt and disappear, or in some cases just don't ever form. And so we may be losing that habitat type for polar bear dens in the southern range. We'll still have river bluffs, we'll still have, bluffs around lakes that they can use, but some of those permafrost soil features that they have used in the past for denning will disappear with warming temperatures.
That's a great question, Jane. Another question from Richard Beck. Has there been any success with experimental bear tags?
Oh, stay tuned.
Yes.
With
Keep
that,
watching.
I think keep watching. I think we have a whole piece on that next week, but we are, and this does have some overlap with conflict, we are looking at better ways to tag and track polar bears. Specific to Churchill, there's been interest in what happens to the bears that they do handle and release. Where do they go? Are they all going north and getting into trouble in other communities, or are they doing other things? Right now, we can only track adult females with collars. And we have, actually I have one here, these satellite ear tags that we can put on adult males and larger subadults as well. But these are permanent attachments, and so they can damage ears. They're not ideal. Yeah, they're just not ideal. So we are looking at new ways, and I think next week we're going to talk about that.
Yes, so another great question, and stay tuned. So that brings us to sort of our final pivot in this triad of approaches to this challenge. I'd like to talk a little bit about technology and tools. So Polar Bears International is currently testing an exciting new radar technology that can reduce encounters by detecting bears before they might come into a town. And Geoff, I was hoping that you could give us a little information about that, about what this is, where it's being tested.
Sure, and we are looking at things across the spectrum, from simpler things like bear spray to more complex things like the compact surveillance radar that we've been working on now and testing here in Churchill, thanks to the initial support of the Hopewell Zoo. We'd spent some time with the radar system over the past 2 years, just getting used to how it works and then starting to test its ability to detect bears. And it turned out it was excellent at detecting bears, along with everything else that's out on the landscape. So in a sense, the radar system was almost too good for our purposes, where we've had to kind of tune it down, because we don't care about waves crashing on the beach. We don't care about willows moving in the wind. We care about big furry bears moving across the landscape. This year, we've been focusing our efforts on teaching the artificial intelligence of the radar system to automatically identify polar bears from other objects. And so that's required us being present either on the ground here or remotely and using the cameras to confirm what the radar is seeing. So the radar will alert, it will give us a clue that something is out there. And I spent time on the lodge or on buggy one, then looking out the window and saying, oh yeah, that's a polar bear, or that's a fox, or, you know, when we could safely do so, we also were able to test it on a person just to give the radar that target information. So over the course of this season, we have 2 radar setups, one at Cape Churchill, one at the Tundra Buggy Lodge. And we've been able to, oh boy, I think it's over 100 targets combined between the 2 systems for just polar bears. So it's been a busy fall being able to train the radar, and perfect for our intentions there. The next phase of this will be deployment in a community, either here in Churchill, if we can sit down with the right partners and have the right level of interest to work with them, or in places like Norway that have also recently had bear attacks and have concerns going on there.
And we have a couple of little videos here, so I'm hoping I can just share these, Geoff, and you can tell the viewers a little bit of what is going on in each.
Sure. So the first one that looks like it's queued up is the radar detecting a bear and then slewing, controlling a point tilt zoom camera and following the target. So the radar system detects movement. It gives you data on what that object is as far as the size, the speed, the hardness of the target. And then it allows you to track it in real time. So it's giving you real GPS locations as that target, in this case, as this bear wanders off into the dark there. This year, it's been interesting training the AI, as you can imagine, as the bear's moving and turning and twisting, it looks different to the radar every time it moves. It's slightly different targets. So you're constantly having to teach it, yep, still a bear, still a bear, still a bear, as the bear changes its geometry relative to the radar panels. So that's why it takes quite a few, you know, target hits and confirmations over time and with different positions of the animal to really get the system rolling so it can automatically do this.
And who knew a bear could make so many shapes?
Absolutely. And it was surprising early on with the radar system that polar bears, while they're large animals, because they're also large furry animals, they show up on radar as a fairly soft target.
Mm.
The screen that Emily has up now shows you kind of the operator's view of the system. So on the green screen, if you will, if you look at the black dot, that's where the radar panels are located. And in this case, again, on Tundra Buggy Lodge, and on the gravel pad, you can see around it with the buggy trails going in the different directions there. And then in the upper left hand, you can see the video window that we can toggle between different cameras to confirm what the radar is seeing. That could also be an infrared camera or other device there that you use. And you can see as the video played, the radar recognizing a target and what the track looks like there as the target moves.
And so you were testing this quite, I imagine spending quite a bit of time on this while you've been in Churchill. And how is the radar performing, and what phase of this project would you say you're currently at, you and your team?
It's performing really well. The way this system works too is we have 2 different panel types in Churchill. We have a longer range, narrower field of focus radar that's out at Cape Churchill. We have a shorter range, wider looking radar at the Tundra Buggy Lodge. Each of those have to be trained separately. Each radar sees the world differently, if you will. And so while we've had, I think, well over 100 hits for both radar systems, we've definitely had more activity out at the Cape. The next step is deployment, is to get this back into a community setting to work with conservation officers or other frontline staff on getting them comfortable with using the system as an additional tool for them. You know, one of the things we really like about this system is right now around the Arctic, we use human eyes to detect polar bears. We use, you know, community members phoning in or radioing in that they've had a sighting, and that's worked well, but we don't see very well in the dark. We don't see very well in fog or snowstorms. And it's difficult, especially in some of those conditions, to track a bear. So a bear might be seen, but then where did it go? Which direction was it headed? And the radar allows you to get that information in real time. So just as an example, with this screen, a wildlife officer could receive a text or an email alert that, hey, there's something out on this area. They can pull the screen up on their phone or on their laptop while they're at their office or at home. They can see what's happening. They can confirm whether it's something they need to respond to or not. And they can potentially direct someone right to where the bear is. So there's no searching around in the dark and wondering where it went. You can follow it in real time.
That's great. Who knew, Geoff? You'd be polar bear scientist to artificial intelligence trainer.
Well, this one I
So,
rely heavily on our tech guru, BJ Kirschhoffer. It's much more of
yes,
an engineering project.
yes. Well, it's certainly really inspiring. It's an inspiring piece of technology and an innovative solution to a unique problem. I do have a
Absolutely.
couple of other questions here that I'm going to punt over to you. Uh, let's start with a question from Leslie. Leslie asks, what is the principal means of livelihood for most of the villages that have polar bear encounters?
Oh, good question, Leslie. Around the Arctic, it varies pretty widely from very traditional, I would say more or less cash-based economies in places like Russia, Greenland, and further in the Canadian North for sure, to places that can be very Western and very modern, like Barrow, Alaska, a city of 5,000, where people make their living like you and I make our livings there. So I'd say a pretty broad range. And that gets into what Emily had brought up earlier is you have very different situations with communities around the Arctic. You have very different um, regional cultures and systems where different things might work better or worse. You have different levels of capacity, both human and financial, and different approaches to conflict. So on the low tech end, you know, like when I was on Wrangel Island last year, and the same is true along the coast of Chukotka, you have people living and working with polar bears that generally have nothing more than a 2-meter pole that they use, and training to use their body language and aggressive posturing to deal with polar bears. If they're lucky, they might have a highway flare to back themselves up, but they're very unlikely to have a firearm. That lethal deterrence just isn't as available and not part of the equation for that region and those cultures. And if you pivot to places in Alaska, this part of Canada, it's a very different approach. It relies more heavily on firearm-based deterrence, things like cracker shells fired out of a shotgun, having that immediate backup of shotgun with slugs if a lethal solution is needed, and other technology and engineering like culvert traps to catch problem bears and things like that, and helicopters here to sling them away from town. Most communities around the north just don't have that capacity.
That was a great question, Leslie. Another question from Matt Brace. Matt says, hi, Geoff. You said that there are still many things we don't know about polar bears. Do you know how many of them navigate out onto the sea ice? And is this based on instinct, or are they reading the landscape in some way using some kind of built-in GPS system?
Good questions, or multiple questions in one.
Yeah.
Uh, so
I
most
believe
of
in
the
you.
world, yeah, I will say all of the world's polar bears prefer to be out on the sea ice, and they would prefer to be on the sea ice year round if they could. even here in Hudson Bay. Here, the sea ice has melted every summer for a very long time. It just used to be a shorter period of time, but as soon as they can, we see that in spades right now, even with a kilometer or two of kind of junky looking ice that you and I would never think of going out on. They're out there as soon as they get the chance. And so it just shows their affinity and desire to be out there and not on land. As far as their ability to navigate, I think that's still one of those wildlife mysteries. They seem to be incredibly adept at navigation, at getting back to places. We just had some correspondence with one of our Norwegian colleagues looking there at what they call philopatry to denning, basically females returning to the same den or the same denning area year after year. And he had a great example of one adult female that denned in the same sort of small valley on the same island in Norway 5 different times. And it was fairly close to where she was born as a cub. But if you think about her home range out in the greater Barents Sea and her ability to go out on moving, floating ice and somehow find this small island again year after year, and not just that, but then relocate this one specific area, they clearly have sort of a built-in GPS of some kind.
Yes, one of the many polar bear mysteries still out there. That was a great question. Okay, well, we're starting to move towards the end of our conversation here. Now, if you have any questions, please feel free to continue to add them into the Q&A. But Geoff, seeing as you've had this really special experience in Churchill for the last month, and you've spent a lot of time viewing bears, maybe more time viewing bears than you have in other Churchill seasons, I'm guessing. I'd love to know I'd love to hear about any notable moments and final reflections from that season.
Sure, I would say the highlight was definitely the mum with triplets, because that is such a rare thing to see in the fall. We do see them in the spring on occasion, but that third cub rarely makes it this long. So to see a healthy mom with 3 healthy, good-looking cubs was really a treat, and it just does make you hopeful that we still can turn things around. Polar bears will respond to good years in very tangible ways. So that was pretty special. And I would say too, just being up here in a year when there was less activity, we saw a lot of bears. We saw a lot of bears up close. One day with a seal kill that was brought near shore, there were over 21 bears immediately around Buggy 1, family groups, adult males, all in tight, all interacting, but no one being particularly aggressive. So just seeing that many bears that close to each other and kind of trading in and out as they went to take turns on this one seal carcass was pretty stunning to see, and just was again a reminder that while we think of polar bears as being antisocial, they have their social ways when they need to. And we also saw that in spades this year with some younger bears sparring, where they, I think, spent as much time wrestling on the ground as they did standing up and sparring.
Yeah, it was absolutely for a stellar year for anybody, I think, that was watching the polar bear cams, and it's amazing that you and the rest of the team up there were able to observe that and check in and keep tabs in a loose observational way on that population of polar bears. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I'm not seeing any others come in right now. Oh, I do have one more. Please hold. Okay, Geoff, how has polar bear conservation been impacted by the current pandemic?
Oh, great question. I would say there's been a pro and a con. So on the plus side, a lot of researchers were home. A lot of papers were written and published, and that's true for PBI as well. From March till now, we have published or been part of the publication of 4 journal articles, which is a lot for one summer period. So on the plus side, people did sit down, have more time at their computers and time in some cases to dust off old projects and get them out the door. On the negative side, no one around the Arctic got out and was able to do planned polar bear field work. So long-term data collection stopped for Norway, for East Greenland, and for Canadian projects. And in places like Hudson Bay, having a gap year after having such a long-term data set that now extends well beyond 30 years isn't great when you go back to do analysis on that. And two, knowing that we've just been seeing so much rapid change, to miss a year in that period of rapid change, could be problematic 5 years from now when folks are going back to try to put together data sets for analysis. So that part wasn't great, but we did have at least the silver lining of increased publications.
Yes. Yes, and there have been some really important publications that have come out of this. So it is certainly a silver lining. And we do actually have a few more questions for you, Geoff. So hold with us. Next question is, research published this month in Ecology and Evolution demonstrated the potential for computer facial recognition techniques to identify individual grizzly bears based on photographs. Is this something that might be useful for identifying polar bears as well? This question is from Anne.
And if it works on grizzly bears, it should work on polar bears. We know that we can do whisker pattern identification for polar bears from research done here in Churchill. The problem with that was you needed a really good photo from a very certain perspective that you could almost never get. And so it wasn't that useful in application. Something like what you're describing could be really useful here to expand information on individuals that are known. So like this year, we saw quite a few family groups in the WMA, and it would be great to be able to identify those adult bears and pass that information on to colleagues at Environment Climate Change Canada and University of Alberta, saying this female was seen with her 2 cubs in great body condition on this date. So that gives them survival and condition data that they can put into their databases that is important, or if a cub is missing that they had seen in the spring or earlier in the year, that's good information to know. So it would absolutely be useful, especially in places like Churchill in Norway, possibly Alaska, where there's a lot of bear viewing and a lot of bear photographs.
Yeah. We have one final question from Bob that's kind of fun. And this is, has anyone won polar bear bingo? And Geoff, I'm not sure if you know that polar bear bingo has been going on.
I don't.
I
don't know what that is.
Well, okay, Bob, I can answer that for you. We do not know the winner of polar bear bingo yet. Because the game is still technically going on as long as the polar bear cam is running. But if you have played and submitted, I will check in with explore.org and we can definitely get back to you about the winner. We had a very fun outreach effort this polar bear week with a full suite of things to look for on the polar bear cam and people playing bingo. So great to hear that you were able to participate, Bob. And with that, I don't think I see any other questions. Thank you very much to Janet for making sure that no questions were missed. And so with that, I think we will start to wrap this up. And Geoff, thank you so much for taking this time on one of your last nights in Churchill. It's been very fun to connect with you from the PBI building and from the interpretive space, and to hear about this work, and also to hear a little bit about your experience up there during this very unique year. So to everybody that is watching, if you have any lingering questions, feel free. You can always follow up with Janet or myself or anybody else at PBI that you have the email address for, and we will do our best to to answer those questions. We will be having more of these events going forward. So we'll have 2 more this fall. Keep an eye on your inbox to let me know, or for you won't let me know, I'll let you know. Keep an eye on your inbox and I will let you know what the topics will be and when you can expect to tune in. And with that, we hope that you all learned something. We hope that you enjoyed your conservation happy hour, whether it was with tea or a cocktail, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future. Thank you all so much for everything you do for the bears. We are deeply appreciative.
Thanks.
Bye.